At family dinner, they said I was nothing. Then Dad's boss called me ma'am. My name is Sarah Cooper. I'm 30 years old, single, no kids, no social media presence worth bragging about. And I rent a one-bedroom apartment across the lake from where I grew up in Mercer Island. Washington, on paper. I look like a footnote in a family full of headlines. My father, Charles Cooper, is a regional director at Axiom Core Technologies, one of the top defense contractors on the West Coast. My sister Becca works in corporate communications at the same company and is often featured in company newsletters with titles like Rising Voices of Innovation or Faces of the Future. She's 2 years older than me, married, owns a home, and according to my mother, has natural presence. What I have, apparently, is good organizational skills. I've heard that phrase enough times to taste it like metal. That night, as I walked into my parents' lakefront home for the first full family dinner in 2 years, I knew exactly what I was walking into, and I still came. My dad was already pouring wine when I stepped in. The air smelled of roasted rosemary chicken and veiled expectations. My mom barely glanced up from the candles she was lighting. "Sarah, you're on time. That's new." I gave a half smile and set the bottle of wine I brought down on the counter. Traffic was kind. Becca arrived a few minutes later, all polished smiles and subtle condescension. Her husband lingered behind her, the silent trophy. Dinner began with a toast to Becca's recent promotion. She had been named Senior Communications Strategist, which, as my father explained with great enthusiasm, meant she would be helping shape the public narrative around a major new defense initiative, a huge deal. He said, "Department of Defense eyes on this one. A lot of pressure. Not for the faint of heart." I nodded, taking a sip of water. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I had seen the reports already. The drafts, the numbers that didn't quite add up. As plates passed and laughter flowed, I watched my family perform the same scene they had played my whole life. Becca would talk about her meetings, her strategic insights. My parents would beam, add context, remind us all of her debate trophies and high school leadership roles. Then, inevitably, someone would remember I existed. "Sarah, are you still in government?" my mom asked. "What exactly do you do again?" "Something with spreadsheets, internal investigations," I replied. "Mostly audit trails and contract compliance these days. So, like, HR. Becca laughed, sipping her wine. "No, federal contract forensics." I clarified. "I audit financial pipelines connected to public-private defense operations." That was technically true. What I didn't say is that I had just completed a quiet, 9-month investigation into procurement fraud tied to a $2.3 billion defense system program, and that the company at the center of it, the one under federal review, was Axiom Core. My father chuckled, clearly missing the undercurrent. "Well, you've always been great at digging through details, even when you were little. Remember your detective notebooks? You used to spy on us for fun." My mother smiled fondly. "I think she still does, just with Excel formulas now." They laughed. Becca joined in. My stomach tightened, but I smiled politely. It had taken years to learn how to hold that expression like a wall, years to stop needing them to take me seriously. Still, it burned. That helpless, hot silence when your work means everything behind closed doors, but nothing to the people who once taught you to speak. I picked at the salad on my plate, letting their conversation swell and wash past me. Becca was headed to San Diego next week to join the CEO at a press briefing. "Jacob's amazing," she gushed, "totally supportive of young talent. He said I remind him of his daughter." My father beamed. "That's huge." "Beck, really? He doesn't say things like that lightly. You're going places." "Some of us already went," I muttered, mostly to myself. But Becca caught it. "What was that?" "Nothing," I replied. "Just thinking." "Well," my dad said, raising his glass, "to our daughters. One shaping narratives. One decoding spreadsheets." I clinked my glass with theirs, held the smile. I didn't say I'd be seeing Jacob too. Just not at a press briefing. I didn't say my clearance outranked both their job titles combined. I didn't say I already knew what he was hiding. That would come later. For now. I let the silence fill the cracks. Because sometimes, you let people walk right past the fire they built without realizing they're standing in smoke. I left the dinner table with a smile still frozen on my face. The kind you wear when it no longer matters if anyone notices how tired it is. My parents lingered in the kitchen, laughing softly as they cleaned up, while Becca and her husband debated paint colors for their third guest room. I slipped upstairs, back to my childhood bedroom where nothing had changed except the silence I brought with me. The same posters from high school still clung to the walls, curling at the corners. My old laptop, long dead, sat beside dusty photo frames where Becca's face always caught the best light. I sat on the edge of the bed and took out my work phone. One new notification waited at the top of the screen. Subject internal escalation approved. Contact General Counsel before proceeding with executive notification. I stared at the words for a long time. Then I opened the encrypted drive and reviewed the file again. The case had started quietly, like most of them did, with a flagged invoice from a subcontractor that didn't match procurement protocol. One mistyped code, one duplicated vendor name. From there, it spread like veins beneath a skin that had looked clean for too long. Over the next 6 months, I had uncovered layers of falsified compliance documentation tied directly to the security infrastructure contract Axiom Corps had won from the Department of Defense. On paper, it was just noise. In context, it pointed to a deliberate pattern of manipulation that routed work through shell contractors at inflated costs, quietly siphoning millions while still delivering deliverables on time. It wasn't enough to trigger alarms outright, but it was enough for an audit team like mine to raise flags. And when those flags reached the Office of Federal Accountability, they didn't just take interest, they handed me the authority to keep going. I was used to working behind layers of names and systems, rarely stepping into daylight. Most of my audits resulted in quiet corrections, a few terminations, a footnote in an annual report. But this one was different. This one had leverage. The shell firms connected back to an old associate of Jacob Lynn, Axiom's CEO, who had been quietly consulting since his early startup days. What made it delicate wasn't just the money, but the timing. Axiom was poised to sign an additional expansion phase of the contract within the quarter. If we moved too soon, we'd jeopardize the entire defense infrastructure transition. Too late, and the fraud would embed itself too deep to pull out. My role was simple. Keep collecting, stay silent, and wait for the clearance to present findings directly. That clearance had just arrived. Back downstairs, I heard my father's voice echo faintly through the hallway. You know, Jacob really sees Becca as a future leader. She's the kind of person who brings stability. Sarah, well, she's always been more private. I closed my eyes for a second and let that sentence linger. It wasn't cruel, just familiar. They had never seen the value in what they couldn't easily categorize, and I had stopped asking them to try. The next morning, I left early before anyone was awake. I took my rental car and drove across the bridge to the city, stopping briefly at a nondescript building tucked between a biotech lab and a storage facility. No signage, just tinted glass and 3 levels of security clearance. Inside, the legal review team handed me a sealed envelope and an encrypted tablet. My task for the day was formal but important. I would meet with a joint oversight committee at a neutral office and prepare them for a preliminary debrief ahead of disclosure to Axiom's board. My name was not on any public paperwork. No cameras, no witnesses. Just data, policy, and the weight of consequence. By noon, I was sitting across from Mariah Owens, my liaison inside the accountability office and the only person on the task force who had known me since our intern days. She pushed a coffee toward me without a word. "You still sure you want to do this?" she asked. I looked at the screen again, then at her. Yes. She nodded once, then handed me the updated script. "If this lands wrong, your father might get dragged in for failing to report, especially if Becca's department signed off on anything questionable. You ready for that?" I didn't answer right away. I thought about the dinner table, the way they had looked right through me, the years of being tolerated instead of understood. Then I said, they made their choices. I'm making mine. Later that afternoon, we got confirmation that Jacob Lynn would be attending the internal review in person next week. Becca would be accompanying him as part of the communications team. They had no idea I would be in the room. No one did, except Mariah and the lead investigator from legal. It wasn't just an audit anymore. It was a turning point, not just for the company, for me. That night, I stood by my hotel window overlooking the skyline. I thought about all the hours I had spent filing reports, triple-checking anomalies, mapping relationships between names no one else noticed. I didn't want revenge. I wanted precision. I wanted truth to be undeniable. And if that truth came wrapped in surprise and awkward silence, so be it. They had laughed at my spreadsheets. They wouldn't laugh at the findings. I turned off the lamp, let the city lights blur behind the glass, and whispered to myself, one more week. The Monday before the internal review, my clearance was unexpectedly paused. No formal suspension, just a slow bureaucratic freeze. My case files were moved into a shared drive I no longer had direct access to, and the internal messaging system flagged my outbound queries as awaiting chain review. I'd seen this tactic before, not illegal, not overt, but intentional. Someone was stalling me. I flagged it to Mariah, who called within the hour. They're trying to box you out. Legal says someone's requested independent verification before your documents get shared with the oversight board. I stared at the screen, already knowing what that meant. They're trying to break the chain of custody, I said. Not if we timestamp everything today. Mariah replied. We're routing it through 2 backups on the federal server. You still in always. I said. The meeting was still on the books. 9:00 a.m. sharp. Conference room 6 at Axiom's headquarters. Jacob Lynn would be there, along with 2 federal advisors, 2 legal auditors, and their communications lead. On the schedule. The name listed was Rebecca Cooper. I looked at it for a long time without blinking. My sister had no idea she'd be walking into a meeting where I'd be seated opposite her. Not as family, not as some forgotten little sister, but as the primary liaison from the federal investigation. I wasn't here to embarrass her. I wasn't here to win. I was here to finish a job no one wanted seen through. The day before the meeting, I returned home for one night to keep the pretense of a normal visit. My mother greeted me with polite distraction, more focused on the fact that Becca had a new blazer she planned to wear for the big Axiom presentation. You should see how sharp she looks in navy, she said, as if that were the pinnacle of career distinction. My father, meanwhile, was glowing with pride over Jacob Lynn's recent shout-out to Becca in the company's quarterly update. He said she's poised, articulate, and consistent. I mean, Sarah. That's the trifecta for leadership. He told me over grilled salmon, oblivious to the irony. That's great, I said evenly, cutting into my food without looking up. You're not nervous, are you? He added suddenly. I mean, I know Becca's role is more front-facing, but I'm sure your work is just as vital behind the scenes. I smiled then. A small one. It is. I said, just less decorative. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the guest room that used to be my old bedroom before Becca had claimed it for yoga gear. The walls were bare now, the corners stacked with unused kettlebells and an unopened humidifier. I stared at the ceiling fan and rehearsed what I would say the next day. Not to Jacob, not to the board, to Becca. In case she looked at me and realized what was happening too late, in case she decided to take it personally. I didn't want her to, but I knew she would. Morning came like a warning bell. The drive to Axiom's downtown tower took exactly 22 minutes. I parked in a reserved slot marked Federal Liaison, clearance ID required. No one saw me enter. The guard at the front desk scanned my ID, nodded respectfully, and directed me to the elevator. I rode to the 34th floor without speaking, eyes fixed forward. When the doors opened, I saw the boardroom ahead, frosted glass, bright light, and through the blur, familiar silhouettes. Becca was already inside. She didn't see me at first. Her back was to the door, flipping through a folder while speaking to someone in legal. I took my seat at the far end of the long table, placing my encrypted tablet on the polished surface and waiting. When the lead auditor called the room to order, everyone turned toward me as introductions began. This is Sarah Cooper, Senior Financial Compliance Investigator assigned under OFA. Her team has been overseeing audit preparation and accountability reporting for the current defense contract held by Axiom. The silence that followed was a vacuum. Jacob's expression didn't move. Becca's did. She blinked once, then again, and then she forced a smile. The kind people use in emergencies. Sarah, she said, trying to laugh like it was a joke. You're part of the review team. I'm leading it, I replied. For this phase. At least, I didn't say more. I didn't need to. Jacob shifted in his seat. I was under the impression this would be a preliminary alignment discussion. It is, the auditor replied. And Ms. Guy, Cooper has the authority to walk us through all submitted documentation. Today's goal is transparency. I opened the file with one tap and began. Becca didn't speak again for nearly 2 hours. The room settled into a heavy silence as the first slide came up on screen. A basic procurement chart, clean and unassuming. I didn't start with accusations. I started with patterns. The way small vendors appeared, vanished, then reappeared under slightly altered names. The way their work orders repeated language pulled directly from internal templates used by Axiom's compliance team. I pointed out the timestamps, the exact invoice duplications, and the dates they aligned with public press releases. I watched as Jacob's brow tensed and one of his fingers tapped rhythmically against the table. The sound was small but revealing. Becca sat perfectly still, her face unreadable now, eyes trained on the numbers but not seeing them. I had expected resistance. I hadn't expected the absence of it. The legal director on Axiom's side leaned forward. Are you implying these vendors are fabricated? I didn't raise my voice or change my tone. I'm stating that their legal registration overlaps with known consultants tied to the personal network of Axiom's executive leadership. Whether or not that constitutes fraud is still under review. It was the truth. Nothing embellished, no color added. The data spoke for itself, and I wasn't here to draw conclusions. I was here to confirm the integrity of the process. That process now involved federal oversight and a temporary freeze on contract expansion until irregularities were addressed. The room reacted the way rooms always do in moments like that. Shifting glances, tightened jaws. The quiet realization that something they thought was background noise was now the headline. Jacob finally spoke, his voice calm but clearly controlled. These are serious implications. I hope you understand what you're putting at stake. I met his gaze. Steady and professional. What's at stake is national security. Sir, if the Department of Defense relies on systems built under compromised procurement chains, it's not just a fiscal issue, it's structural. He didn't respond immediately, and he didn't have to. His silence was enough. He had seen the data. He just hadn't expected someone like me to be the one walking it into the room. Becca finally broke her silence near the end of the session. She cleared her throat and asked a question I hadn't anticipated. Sarah, she said carefully, her voice tight at the edges. Why didn't you tell me? The question wasn't aggressive, it was real. But I didn't answer it the way a sister would, because that would have constituted a breach of federal confidentiality, I said plainly. You were on the project team. But we're family, she said, softer now. Were you really investigating us this whole time I was investigating a contract? I replied. Names came later. That wasn't a defense. It was a fact, a necessary one. As the meeting adjourned, I packed my files slowly, watching how no one made eye contact with Jacob anymore. Even his assistant looked dazed, unsure of where authority now rested. Before I could leave, the lead federal advisor stopped me at the door. We'll need your full summary and all supplemental evidence by Thursday. Expect this to escalate to the Contracting Oversight Board by early next week. I nodded. Understood. Then I walked out without looking back. I didn't see Becca again until that evening. I was sitting outside a quiet coffee shop near the waterfront, reviewing the presentation again, when I heard her voice behind me. You should have told me. She sat down across from me without asking. I closed the file. Would it have changed anything I asked? I don't know, she said. Maybe. Maybe I would have stepped off the project. Maybe I would have told Dad. Or maybe I would have fought you. She said it without anger, but also without apology. Did you think I wouldn't understand? No. I said, I thought you wouldn't believe me. That made her pause. She looked out toward the bay, then back at me. You were always the quiet one, the one who knew things but never said them. And you were always the one people listened to, I said, even when you didn't know what you were saying. For the first time. She didn't flinch. I didn't know about the vendors. She said after a while, at least not directly, but some of it felt wrong. Then maybe now's the time to make it right. I said, you're still on the inside. She looked at me then, really looked, like she was seeing a version of me that had always been there but just out of reach. You've changed, she said. Not really, I replied. I just stopped waiting to be seen. By Thursday, the pushback became visible. A set of emails I had previously flagged was suddenly locked behind internal compliance review, despite being part of an open audit chain. When I called legal for clarification, they claimed there had been a request from Axiom's executive council to delay external distribution until proper internal procedures had been followed. It was a vague but calculated move, one designed to slow the bleeding while they figured out how deep the wound was. I wasn't surprised. I had always known this case would reach a point where silence would be more dangerous than exposure. What did surprise me, though, was how quickly the people around me began to disappear. Mariah was the first to warn me. She called late that night, voice low, words carefully chosen. There's chatter that Jacob wants to petition for reassignment of oversight, claims you have a conflict of interest due to familial ties. I didn't answer at first. I just stared out the window of my apartment, watching headlights flicker across the freeway like a slow-moving threat. Let him try, I finally said. I documented everything. I know, she replied. But this isn't about what you've done. It's about what they think they can get away with if they twist the narrative fast enough. Then I'll move faster, I said, and hung up. The next morning, I submitted a formal declaration of no material conflict, backed by 2 years' worth of audit logs, signed witness reports, and cross-agency communication records. I also included a timeline of how and when I had recused myself from any reviews that involved public family association. My work had always lived in the shadows, but now, for the first time, it was stepping into a space where image mattered more than integrity. And I was not a polished candidate for public approval. I didn't have Becca's charm or my father's corporate polish. What I had were timestamps, evidence trails, and a name people forgot until it showed up in their compliance reports. By Friday, the pressure was building. Someone from Axiom leaked an internal memo suggesting the audit findings were the result of misinterpreted data by a junior-level investigator. The wording was carefully chosen, vague enough to avoid direct liability, but sharp enough to discredit. I was neither junior nor misinformed, but they were testing the waters, seeing if I would flinch. I didn't. Instead, I scheduled a meeting directly with the Office of Defense Partnerships. It was the highest authority tied to the contract and had the power to override private delays. The meeting was approved within hours, and I knew then that I was not alone, even if the room felt that way. Saturday came with quiet, like it was holding its breath. I spent the morning walking the same trail I used to run in college, back when things felt smaller, easier, even if they weren't. The trees were taller now, but the silence between them was the same. I remembered walking that path alone the night I found out Becca had been offered her first leadership track at Axiom. My parents had celebrated with dinner and a framed photo. They never asked if I wanted to come. They had assumed I was busy. And in a way, I had been in D.C. finalizing a contract review that shut down a cyber vulnerability affecting 3 government agencies. That report never made it to any photo frame. That evening, I sat down and opened a letter I hadn't dared read until now. It was from Eliza Tran, my mentor from the early years. She had trained me quietly, watching how I noticed patterns others missed, teaching me how to disappear into data while seeing everything. The letter was simple, just a note congratulating me on holding the line when most people walked away. At the end, she wrote, "You won't win by being louder. You'll win by being the last one standing when the noise collapses on itself." I folded the paper and placed it inside the same folder that held my final report. It was almost time. By Sunday night, I got word that Jacob Lynn had requested an emergency closed-door meeting with Axiom's internal board. There was no agenda listed, but I knew what it meant. He was preparing to pivot, possibly cut losses, and shift blame before the official findings reached federal review. If he could sell the board a scapegoat, he might save the contract. If he couldn't, he'd have to explain how internal fraud persisted on his watch while his PR team, including Becca, was parading transparency in front of the media. The pressure wasn't just mine anymore. It had shifted, quietly, strategically, and all I had to do was hold still. Because sometimes the most powerful move isn't to fight harder, it's to wait until the truth can no longer be ignored. The following week opened in silence, the kind that doesn't calm you, just sharpens everything else. On Monday morning, the board approved the closed-door session requested by Jacob Lynn, and I was formally notified that my access to all Axiom-related communications would be suspended pending internal review. It was a predictable move, and one I had already planned for. By then, the critical audit files had already been mirrored to the secure archive system, time-stamped and verified by third-party compliance. They could lock me out, but they couldn't rewrite what had already been sealed. I didn't tell anyone what I planned next, not Mariah, not Eliza. I had learned the hard way that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is not put others in the line of fire for a battle they didn't start. That Tuesday, I took a leave of absence, citing exhaustion and internal conflict of ethics. It bought me space, and more importantly, it gave them the illusion I was backing down. I didn't fight their decision. I didn't respond to the passive-aggressive emails or the silence from my father, who still hadn't called or asked if I was okay. I let them believe I was fading quietly into the background. It was the safest place to work from. That same afternoon, I booked a private meeting with the Office of Contract Integrity at the federal level. I wasn't there to make noise. I was there to hand over clean, untampered records of every irregularity I had found, along with documented communications from Axiom's senior staff attempting to delay or suppress internal action. I was deliberate with my language, not accusatory, just factual. I didn't need emotion to tell this story. The numbers did that on their own. And for the first time since this started, the person across the table didn't look at me like I was overreaching. He looked like he had been waiting for this. The next day, the department launched a secondary review of Axiom's vendor relationship status. It wasn't public, not yet, but people inside began to feel it. The quiet changed. Where there had been polite avoidance, there was now nervous over-clarification. People started CCing departments they'd previously ignored. Even Becca. She reached out for the first time in weeks. A 3-line message saying, "Can we talk privately?" No apology. No context. Just an attempt to reframe proximity before the narrative shifted. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be clearer in silence. By Friday, a media watchdog picked up on the irregularities in Axiom's contract renewal reports. They hadn't named names, but the phrasing was unmistakable. Anonymous sources suggest internal suppression of audit concerns tied to executive-level operations and public relations handling. My name wasn't in the piece, but my fingerprints were on every fact they had. The story began to travel, and just like that, people who had once dismissed me as the other Cooper started asking questions. Not to me, not publicly, but I felt it. The shift. It was small, but it was real. I spent that weekend quietly drafting a statement, not for the media, not for social optics, but for the next compliance hearing. It was simple, just a 3-page document outlining the timeline, the data, and the discrepancies that couldn't be explained away with interpretation errors. I didn't use adjectives. I didn't need them. The facts were clean, and I had learned something important along the way. Sometimes, the most strategic form of revenge is the kind that doesn't look like revenge at all. It's just the truth, presented without apology. at a volume that can't be ignored. On Monday, Becca showed up at my apartment. I didn't let her in. She stood there, perfect as always, hair done, coat pressed, but something in her eyes was unsteady. "I didn't know it would go this far," she said quietly. "Then you shouldn't have helped them hide it." I replied. She looked away. For a second. I almost felt sorry for her, but pity is not the same as forgiveness, and she had made her choice long before I made mine. I closed the door before she could say anything else. I didn't owe her the space to perform sincerity, not anymore. By that afternoon, I received confirmation that the department's investigative panel had requested an emergency review session. The language was clear: urgent consideration of vendor compliance violations. Axiom wouldn't be able to spin this behind closed doors anymore, and I wouldn't need to say a word in my own defense. Everything was already in motion. Because the most powerful statement I could ever make wasn't in a press release or a confrontation. It was the quiet, relentless persistence of facts no one could erase. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like a background character in someone else's spotlight. I felt seen, not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it. By Wednesday morning, the department's review hearing was confirmed. I wasn't asked to testify. I didn't need to be. My report had already been cited in the internal docket as a primary evidence file, and the data sets I'd collected had been declared unaltered and traceable. It felt like standing at the edge of a field I'd once been exiled from, watching the fire burn not because I lit it out of anger, but because the dry lies had long since made the place flammable. No one could pretend they didn't smell smoke anymore. The news didn't break publicly, not all at once. It started with a quiet pullback. Axiom's name disappeared from a panel they had sponsored for years. Their head of PR stepped down to spend more time with family. Becca's weekly press briefings went from polished video to short email statements signed off with no title. No one said it was because of me. That was fine. I wasn't doing any of this to be thanked. I wasn't even trying to be understood. I just wanted the damage to stop. And maybe, for the first time, for someone to admit that what I'd carried wasn't fiction, that it had weight, that it had happened. I spent that week wrapping up the last of my compliance work, transferring access, cleaning logs, backing up internal research. When my final day came, I packed my things slowly, not because I was sentimental, but because I wanted to leave no loose ends they could weaponize later. The office was almost empty. Most of the people I had trusted were long gone. A few colleagues stopped by quietly to say goodbye. One of them left a note on my desk that simply read, "You did what most of us couldn't. You stayed honest." I folded it without speaking. My father didn't reach out. Not once. Neither did Becca. That silence, ironically, felt louder than anything else. I wasn't angry anymore. Just clear. People will rewrite your story in their own favor for as long as you let them. But once you stop defending yourself and start documenting, they lose control of the script. I never needed their apology. I needed distance, and now I finally had it. 2 weeks later, a Congressional Oversight Committee issued a statement about increased scrutiny on tech vendors tied to public contracts. The wording was broad, but buried in the appendix was an exhibit labeled Case Reference Cooper v. Axiom, including a link to a full audit file. It wasn't redacted. It wasn't hidden. It was just there. And for the first time in my life, I didn't have to explain what I had seen. I didn't have to argue. The truth stood on its own. When I saw Becca next, it was by accident. We were both walking out of the same federal building, though headed to very different meetings. She looked tired. Her voice was soft. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said. I nodded. Not with anger, but with quiet recognition. "You were so busy protecting the image," I said. "You forgot the truth was never a liability. Hiding it was." She blinked, looked away, and left without another word. I didn't follow. A few days later, someone forwarded me an internal email from Axiom's advisory board. They were appointing interim leadership for ethics oversight. Not that it mattered to me anymore. I wasn't returning. But it was good to know the system hadn't collapsed. It was changing. Slowly. Maybe. But honestly, this time, I took a job consulting for a nonprofit that worked on whistleblower protections in federal tech. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't high-paying, but every day, I got to help someone who had been made to feel invisible realize that the facts they carried could shift power. I never put my name on their reports. I didn't need to. I had already made my statement, and it echoed, even in rooms I no longer walked into. One evening, I visited the old Cooper family estate, not to enter, just to stand across the street. It looked the same, polished and tall and proud, but for the first time. I didn't feel small in front of it. I didn't feel like a daughter asking to be let in. I felt like a woman who had built something stronger than a legacy of silence. I had built clarity, and clarity, once seen, doesn't unsee itself. Because sometimes, revenge isn't rage or exposure or flame. Sometimes, it's walking away with your records intact and your soul unbent, not needing them to fall, but knowing you never bowed. Months passed. The media eventually moved on. The hearings wrapped up quietly, with some statements sealed, others heavily edited. A few executives resigned, citing personal reasons, and Becca took an indefinite sabbatical from all public roles. I watched it unfold from a distance, not with glee, but with a strange kind of peace. I wasn't the hero in their eyes. I wasn't even part of the narrative, but the damage they built on silence had finally cracked, and that was enough. At the nonprofit, I kept my name low on the masthead. I didn't care about titles anymore. I worked on policy, documented cases, trained younger whistleblowers on how to protect themselves, both digitally and emotionally. Most of them didn't know my past, and I preferred it that way. I didn't want admiration. I wanted to be useful. One of the new hires, a sharp analyst named Elise, once asked me how I stayed calm when retaliation hit. I told her the truth. You stop hoping they'll understand, and you start trusting that truth, documented carefully, will outlive opinion. Around that time, I received a message request from my mother. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years. Her message was short. Your father's retiring. The family's hosting a dinner. It would mean a lot if you came. There was no apology, no mention of what had happened. Just a polite invitation, as if everything in between had been a misunderstanding instead of a betrayal. I sat with it for days, unsure whether to respond. Eventually, I replied, "Thank you, I'll think about it." I didn't attend the dinner. I did, however, make a decision. I sent a donation in my father's name to a legal defense fund for workers who'd been erased or discredited by family-owned corporations. The receipt was sent to the family office. There was no note attached. I didn't need to explain the gesture. They would understand, or they wouldn't. Either way, I wasn't asking for entry anymore. One evening, I walked by a bookstore that had once hosted a panel I was removed from years ago. In the window was a new nonfiction title, The Weight of Silence, Ethics, and Erasure in Family Enterprises. My name wasn't on the cover, but as I skimmed the acknowledgments inside, I saw a line that read, "For the ones who were never believed until the data spoke louder than the damage." I smiled, not because I needed credit, but because the culture was shifting, slowly, quietly, but permanently. Weeks later, I received a call from a journalist. He had been investigating institutional corruption across legacy firms and wanted to confirm a few archived documents tied to Axiom's internal audit. I verified what I could. He paused before ending the call. "I know you never gave an interview, but if you ever do, it won't be just a story. It'll be a blueprint." I thanked him, but I didn't commit. I wasn't ready for the spotlight. I wasn't even sure I wanted it. Sometimes, healing isn't loud, it's private. It's in choosing what not to say. It's in reclaiming your silence on your terms, not theirs. Not long after, I received a package at my apartment. Inside was a single flash drive with no label, no sender. I scanned it carefully, protocol now, and found a set of old voice memos, my own recordings. From the weeks I was being pushed out, quiet reflections, fragments of meetings, emotional timestamps. I had thought I lost them when my old device was wiped. Someone had kept a copy. Someone, I guessed, who had once been silent too. I archived them securely, then backed them up to an encrypted drive labeled, simply, "Proof exists." I didn't revisit them. Not yet. But I knew I would. Someday. Maybe not to use. Maybe just to remember. Because survival in these stories isn't always about winning. Sometimes. It's about staying whole while they try to erase you. It's about carrying the truth forward without needing to destroy the people who couldn't carry it with you. And in that quiet distance between what happened and what could have been, you find peace. I started teaching a night course on digital ethics and emotional evidence. My students were young, idealistic, sometimes too quick to believe that exposure equals justice. I didn't correct them. I just taught them how to hold documentation like a compass, not a weapon. I told them how to spot patterns, not just personalities. I told them, always, to write things down not because people will believe you immediately, but because you will believe yourself more fully when you see your experience reflected in your own words. And in that final version of myself no longer erased, but not vengeful either, I found something better than revenge. I found authorship over my choices, over my past, over the voice they tried to reduce to a whisper. Not all stories end with applause. Some just end with you walking away, calm, intact, and finally unafraid of your own voice. A few months after I began teaching, I received a handwritten letter. Not an email, not a typed memo, just pen on paper. It came from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Becca's assistant. Layla. We had never been close, but she had seen more than she let on. Her note was short, careful, and deliberate. She said she'd left the company shortly after I was pushed out, said the atmosphere had changed, said the silence that used to protect people like Becca had started to feel heavier, more dangerous, more suffocating. And then, in a single line near the end, she wrote, "I kept copies. I just didn't know who deserved them." That line stayed with me. Deserved, as if truth was a reward instead of a record. But I understood. People like us didn't chase credit. We chased clarity. And sometimes, that clarity only came from someone who had nothing to gain by offering it. I never replied to Layla. I didn't need to. Her act had already spoken loud enough. I just filed the letter safely, next to the encrypted drive. And I slept easier that night. Not because I had power again, but because I had confirmation that what happened wasn't just in my head, that even quiet witnesses could carry pieces of justice forward. Around that time, I was invited to speak at a leadership forum, ironically, hosted by one of the firms that had once distanced themselves from me after my name got pulled into internal drama. The invite said the panel would focus on ethical recovery and silent resilience. I almost laughed. Silent resilience. The phrase sounded clean and inspiring on a brochure, but in reality, it meant years of invisibility, coded judgment, and having to prove your worth twice as hard with half the support. Still, I accepted, not to prove anything, but to see what kind of conversations were finally being allowed. I wore no brand logos, no visible symbols of the companies that had once rejected me. I walked into that auditorium not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone who had survived something unnamed and decided that silence was no longer the currency I traded in. The room was full of polished names, executives, editors, a few politicians who had rebranded themselves as advocates. But during the Q&A, a young woman in the back stood up. Her voice shook slightly, but her question cut through the room. How do you rebuild when you were erased so early? No one remembers you were there. Every eye turned toward me. I didn't offer theory. I offered memory. I told her, you document everything, not for revenge, for your own coherence. You write it down so you remember it was real, even when they pretend it wasn't. The applause wasn't loud. It wasn't needed. What mattered was that the silence that used to hang over these rooms was shifting, not disappearing, but cracking, and in that crack, something real could take root. After the forum, I stayed behind to speak with a few attendees. One of them handed me a business card from a media platform I had quietly helped build years ago, before my name was scrubbed from the credits. I smiled at the logo, not with bitterness, but with distance. The woman said, "We're restructuring. Would you ever consider advising us again?" I didn't say yes, but I didn't say no. I just said, "Send me what you've got. I'll read it closely." That night, I walked home alone through a quiet city street. The air felt clear in a way I hadn't noticed in years. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore. I wasn't calculating who might use my words against me. I had learned how to speak without fear and listen without flinching. I had learned how to stay standing in a room that once tried to fold in on me. I still kept a folder called unsent letters, notes I had written to family, former colleagues, even to Becca, things I would never send, not because I forgave them fully, but because I no longer needed their recognition to validate my healing. The power they had was no longer mine to carry, and letting go of that weight didn't make me weak. It made me free. One night, I reread one of those unsent letters. It was addressed to my younger self, the version of me who thought silence was strength, who thought boundaries meant isolation, who thought survival meant shrinking small enough not to be seen. I read it out loud once, in the quiet of my apartment, just to hear how far I had come. And then I shredded it. Not out of shame, but because I had already lived every word. I didn't need to keep it anymore. This wasn't the ending I imagined years ago when everything fell apart. But in many ways, it was better. There was no dramatic reveal, no apology broadcast, no public redemption arc, just quiet, steady, earned restoration. In my name, on my terms. Some weekends, I still walk past the old building where I first worked. They've remodeled it, new windows, modern signage, sleek reception. You'd never guess the stories hidden in those walls. Most people don't remember who laid the foundation for things that look effortless now. That used to bother me. Not anymore. Because now I know legacy isn't about being remembered by name. It's about what remains standing when you leave with your head high and your truth intact. There was one afternoon, not long ago, when I visited a design exhibit hosted by a group of young professionals. A few of them had reached out after the forum, asking if I could stop by. I agreed, quietly. No announcement, no name tag. I walked in and recognized parts of my old frameworks methods I'd once built from scratch in silence, while others took credit. But this time, I didn't feel erased. I felt extended. The work had evolved. They had made it better, cleaner, braver. And none of them knew I was the one who started that thread. I didn't correct them. I just stood at the edge of the room, watching. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace, not proof. That night, I got a message from someone unexpected, my sister. We hadn't spoken since the holiday years ago when she took Becca's side without blinking. Her message was short, saw your name in the credits. Just wanted to say, maybe I was wrong. I stared at it for a long time, not out of shock, but because it came too late to hurt, too late to heal. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Sometimes silence is not absence. It's a boundary. I've learned that quiet power isn't about withholding or punishing. It's about not handing your clarity to someone who hasn't earned it. Growth doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it shows up as a calm morning where your hands aren't shaking, your voice doesn't catch, and your story finally belongs to you again. One of the most valuable things I did was mentor a young woman named Lonnie. She reminded me of myself back then, not in ambition, but in how carefully she tiptoed around people who hadn't earned her caution. I told her one thing over coffee that I wish someone had told me years ago. Don't confuse being agreeable with being safe. Safety comes from knowing you can walk away and still be whole. She wrote that down. I didn't mean for her to, but maybe she needed it more than I realized. Maybe we all did. Now, I get messages from strangers, people who saw a panel clip or read an old essay I wrote under a ghost name. They say the same thing in different words. I thought I was alone. That's how they get you. I always think, the system, the silence, they make you believe isolation is your fault instead of their design. But once you speak, even a little, years ago, I used to daydream about some grand confrontation, Becca calling to apologize, former colleagues admitting they knew the truth all along, my name being restored in some official way. Now I wouldn't take the call, not because I'm angry, but because I'm busy. I'm teaching, consulting, writing under my own name. I'm living, and in that life. There's no room left for revisionist performances. Just quiet, steady authorship. My revenge, if you want to call it that, didn't come wrapped in public vindication. It came in private restoration, in not having to explain anymore, in no longer shrinking to fit the version of me that made others comfortable, in waking up, knowing I built something honest out of what they tried to bury. These days, when people ask what happened back then, I tell them the truth, simply, no rage, no spin, just facts. And I watch their faces change, not from shock, but from recognition. Because in every room, there's someone who's been rewritten, downsized, silenced, or set aside. My story just gives them a shape to name it. I didn't lose everything. I lost illusions, and in their place, I gained something better: discernment, direction, a voice I don't hand out easily, not because it's fragile, but because it's earned. If I could go back, I wouldn't rewrite a thing. Every erasure taught me something. Every betrayal sharpened my outline, and every quiet win that followed reminded me that impact is not always loud. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is keep building after they stop watching. So, if you're reading this, and you've ever been cut out, talked over, rewritten, or underestimated, I'll ask you the same question I asked myself the night I deleted that unsent letter. What are you building now that no one can take credit for but you? Because maybe the real win isn't being seen again. Maybe it's choosing what you see next.